So, Charlie, it's so hard to ignore NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA had their GTC conference last week, and honestly, it's all anybody could talk about for at least a couple of days. What stood out to you looking at the intersection of AI and IT and everything else?
Well, let's start with what maybe is obvious or not, I suppose, but that this is a hardware company, or at least in theory, a hardware company, a chip
Yes.
company, again, in theory. And other than maybe Apple, we don't really talk much about hardware these days. Hardware has been abstracted away from almost everything that we do in many, many ways.
Mhm.
And so the mere fact that there's this much attention on this type of a conference is sort of eye-opening in and of itself.
Mhm.
To the point that I mentioned, I almost didn't like tune in terms of like, is this something that is really, really relevant to an enterprise IT audience, unless you are the biggest companies in the world. And I'm really glad I did tune in, mostly because it was a bit of a wake-up call. It was, for me, astounding the scale of what we're talking about. Incredibly technical. I mean, I don't think I'm a slouch, and I'm like constantly Googling and dropping stuff into, Chat GPT, like what the heck is that? And
Right.
trying to process all these numbers and getting my head around the scale of it. And, effectively talking about an entirely new data center architecture, an entire new computing architecture that is about a scale that is truly unimaginable. I remember I was in Saudi Arabia talking with the CTO for Cray about, HPC, high performance computing, a few years ago. And it was literally like, there's like 10 companies in the world need this level of stuff, right? And now suddenly we're on a main stage of a conference talking about this in very real terms, that and still not the average company, but where this is a mainstream sort of topic, at least. Um, so that was a big takeaway. And I think what's challenging about it is that if I'm an enterprise CIO and I don't work for one of the 50 largest companies in the world, it's probably still not relevant. I'm probably still not buying NVIDIA products
Mhm.
to any great scale and rebuilding my data center. But I do think it's relevant because of some of the things we're going to be talking about. They also introduce some software stuff I know you want to get into, which I think is going to be very, very impactful, even at lower ends, at the more mortal ends of the scale. I also think, though, that it's setting up this big versus small conversation that we're going to have today,
Mhm.
because the scale that they are driving is going to truly create an entire new class. Um, that I think, even, for me, I'm like struggling to get my head around it. So it was, you've heard the phrase drinking from a fire hose. Well, I felt like I got dumped into a circular pit where I had 100 fire hoses hitting at me, and I had to drink from all of them at once. I mean, it was just like overwhelming, just the amount of information, and not even just information, but the imagination that it sort of was sparking of like, where is all this really, really going?
Yes. So I watched the Jensen Huang keynote for GTC along with some CRM analysts, namely Brent Leary, Paul Greenberg, some fantastic minds in the software space. And honestly, for the first hour, when we were watching, hardware detail after detail after detail, honestly, it was mind numbing. Like I know what is semiconductors. I worked for a semiconductor test company, Teradyne. So it's not like I don't understand what a chip is, but even so, the level of detail we were getting into, I was thinking, from a practical perspective, this is not a level that I work at. I don't do chip fab. This is not my life. I work on we're using compute and storage for various use cases. But I feel like even so, the second hour of his keynote got into what could be done with AI at a point that was understandable to almost everybody. People could see, oh, this is how I could put this into field service. This is how I can put this into sales. This is how I could actually create something with AI in a way that perhaps I can't do today, but is going to come up to me in the near future. And I thought that part was very engaging. But I agree with you exactly on that infrastructure abstraction point. So this T-shirt I'm wearing, "Sleep More." Ironically, this is a T-shirt I got from IBM Cloud. I think it's one of their best marketing hashtags ever, because the idea is, you push everything to the cloud and you sleep more. But we are actually going away from that right now, where you actually have to think about hardware again, and all the details are coming back because we're seeing another order of magnitude compute necessary to make everything happen, and we don't have the tools to do it. One of the reactions that I saw from NVIDIA that I thought was really amusing was hearing NVIDIA talk about, oh yeah, all of our customers are already doing like 50 or 100 different types of retrieval augmented generation activities. And I'm like, that is not where the average company is right now. I can assure you of that. They do not have 100 different rags that they're using to augment their generative AI models, right? There's still this huge gap between where NVIDIA's average enterprise customer is and where the average enterprise is. And I think bridging that gap is going to be an immense change in IT.
Well, there are two follow up points to that. I think first of all, I think the reality is most of their customers are not enterprises the way we typically talk about. They are the cloud providers, they are
Mhm.
the mega companies, etc. So I think there's that. Secondly, I mean, frankly, he particularly that first hour, it was over the head of most people in the room, who arguably are the people that are most invested in this. I mean,
Mhm.
it was hilarious. He'd go through something, and it's like he'd pause for applause, and you could tell it's like nobody like we couldn't even absorb it all. It's like, oh, we're supposed to applaud here. It's like we better,
Mhm.
it's the applause lines were, but there was another article which I realized I didn't even send you, from Fast Company, talking about how NVIDIA was demoing an Apple Vision Pro app that
Mhm.
was basically one of the big NVIDIA pushes is this idea of the digital twin. And basically, for this writer, was saying that this is the first time that the light bulb sort of went off about the transformative power of leveraging something like spatial computing, i.e., the Apple Vision Pro,
Mhm.
in combination with a cloud based supercomputer, i.e., NVIDIA's architecture, to render this car in full fidelity that could literally walk around it and inspect it and do everything that you might want to do with it from like a design perspective without actually being there. But of course, being able to change its color dynamically, change configuration, doing all
Mhm.
these things. And I think, in the second half, that's what you're starting to see, the manifestation of what happens when you start reimagining the architecture. But it is that, and I think, one of the things, another article I read, was talking about how, we need to probably stop calling NVIDIA a GPU company, and probably not even a chip company. And this latest example, or these announcements, were a classic case. I mean, it was half of it was networking and fiber channel and all this other stuff that is necessary because the scale and the speed are so dramatic that everything is different. And so I think, it is about sorting out what parts are, I think for me, the big takeaway is, one, recognize that we are at a sea change. We are at a fundamental shift of what the future of computing is going to be. Now, what I'm not sure of is this going to be bifurcated? Are we going to have this future where there's the mere mortal technology and then the big companies that are running this stuff? Or more likely, in my opinion, is, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, it's going to take time, but where this becomes the only computing model and really displaces everything else. And what does that then mean if you're a CIO today who plans on still having a job 10 or 15 years from now? I don't know. I think there's like, you need to at least be aware of all of that. And then the next big thing is the imagination question of like, okay, so as we go down that road, how you better be reimagining things and really kind of paying attention to where this could be going for your organization.
Yeah, and for me, that's why I feel like the announcement that I was able to grasp a hold of most and understand the most was around their new software platform, the NVIDIA Inference Microservices that they are going to be providing as to be able to help with model deployment. So NVIDIA understands that outside of the geniuses at Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, honestly, a lot of us are not well equipped to actually create models at this point. And although some startups like Databricks are definitely helping with that large language model deployment, it's still hard. So I liked that they are thinking about inferences, micro services, and providing a container that basically says plug and play container to be able to support a model. And then I don't care if you put it on your server or put it in the cloud or whatever. We're just going to give you, the container to be able to move forward and at least get started. I think that's an important piece of the platform, the as a service that is necessary to make these models useful going forward. So at least NVIDIA is thinking about that bridge. Of course, you've got the problem that nobody can buy a GPU anyways, because all the big companies have already sucked them up. So all you can do is rent them on the cloud for right now. But at least NVIDIA is thinking about this next step for the CIO, not just the future facing CTO at a global 50 company, but the rest of us who might actually want to do this going forward.
So I think first of all, I think the introduction of NIMs, as they're being called, I think is absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Probably one of the things that the Intels of the world always struggled with is getting out of that. I'm just buried in the data center kind of thing where people didn't have any exposure to it. So they're capitalizing very much so, I think, on their brand recognition right now and putting themselves in the place where people are going to be interacting much more directly with the brand, and I think that is brilliant. I'm not convinced, at least out the gate, that we're going to see a whole lot of traditional enterprise adoption of NIMs. I still think it's an abstraction layer away for most organizations today. But the mere fact that it's going to be available in the the AWS and the Azure marketplaces, and it's a plug and play function, means that now these traditional enterprises at least can start playing with it. They can start spinning these things up and seeing how they can start experimenting with it. And I think that is going to put them in a new class. But I think we're clearly, I think, going to see the very first adopters of this are going to be, and I know we're going to be talking about this in a little bit, but like the ServiceNows of the world that are saying, hey, this is a way to accelerate our own adoption of leveraging some of what we're doing to build some proprietary tech, proprietary models using this and not having to build all this. So I think, it is very, I still find it shocking that, this is a company that basically made, a gaming chip. That's what this all started with, right?
Yes.
And is now the torchbearer for effectively anything that's related to AI. And it's shocking to me. So, but yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the NIMS in particular play out, because it's sort of a bridge to the mortal world.
Yeah, they've been both lucky and good. And of course, there's a very mixed record for infrastructure and chip companies trying to become software companies. Intel wanted to be a software company. EMC wanted to be seen as a software company. We're seeing with Broadcom and VMware right now, which we talked about last week. Broadcom wants to be a software company. All these hardware companies want to be software companies. But with all the hype around AI, NVIDIA actually has a shot to bridge that gap that so many other large and very successful companies have struggled to do.
Yeah, what I will be curious about on that particular front is that the challenge with the approach they're taking. So again, I think it's brilliant, but the challenge is that if I'm Amazon or if I'm Azure, if I'm Microsoft, I have no differentiation if I can get the exact same NIM from either player, right? And so it's going to lead to, you're already seeing it, right? That the major cloud providers are going to be doing versions of this themselves. And so I think it's going to be an interesting sort of, competitive partner sort of relationship that exists, as this is what always happens, right? Every chip manufacturer or every hardware maker wants to get into software because it's much more scalable. I don't have the incremental cost of producing a piece of hardware. So they want to be in the software business, but they're partnered with the software companies that are building stuff on top of their chips. And the minute they start competing with them in some way, then you get this conflict. And it generally, as you pointed out, doesn't go that well for the hardware companies. So it will be very curious to see how this plays out over time. But I do think the advantage that NVIDIA has is A, they have complete dominance, and B, I think that there is so much demand right now that there's plenty of opportunity and people will be experimenting with everything. But yeah, it was just stuff going on.
Yes.